Thank you for taking time to join us in this MREF IDRC webinar. I am Natina, and I'm very excited and delighted today to share the forum with Paul to present our research findings based on 3 years of work with MREF. And we have a great international team of scholars from different parts of the world, as you see in the cover here. And we have a very, very excellent and diligent team from MREF. I welcome, whoever is working on different research projects to work together with MREF and continue to collaborate as we learn together to know more about local politics and gender issues in Myanmar. Without further ado, I'm going to turn to the next page. Okay, so given the time constraint, I'm just going to briefly go through our research products and present the key findings and policy recommendations in the first part of this seminar. Paul will take over from there in the second part and talk about the political events that have been happening thus far in 2015 to 2020, especially with regards to political parties' selection of women candidates, and also give us a brief update of the status of women's political representation and participation for the run-up to 2020 GE. We are really privileged to have Paul here with us because he has so much connections and understanding of what's going on the ground. Next. So the broad title of our research project is Engendering Political Recruitment and Participation at the Party, Local, and National Level. So what we are interested is to investigate how the opportunities are different for men and women to become politicians in Myanmar and why. And we want to find out how these factors and conditions are different for both men and women to participate in the local politics too. And to do so, we have our research method includes 3 stages. The first stage in 2017, we conducted a bunch of elite interviews with 9 parties, total of 72 interviews with 2 groups of people. One group, what we call party elites, which constitutes MPs and party leaders. And another group, we interviewed candidates, both winners and losers, men and women, who participated in elections in 2015 and 2010. In the stage 2 of our research, we conducted quantitative survey and focus group discussions. And this is really amazing. The MREF and the team have conducted more than 2,800 surveys in 4 regions, generally equally divided in 25% population sample size in 4 regions, and to figure out attitudes towards men and women's participation in politics. And Paul has also spearheaded focus groups discussions with 99 groups, and also conducted semi-structured interviews together with MREF at the wards and village level. So our research really focuses, and probably one of the few that really focuses on the politics at the local level. And the third stage of our research, we spend a lot of time doing data analysis, collaborating and writing reports. Different parts of the group come together to divide and conquer. And MREF has done an excellent job, especially ALE, in publicizing the work to a wide media channels in Myanmar. Back. So the key research products that we have are as follows. We have produced 2 working papers, 2 to 3 briefing reports, and 1 final synthesis report that I'm going to present basically the key findings and the key policy recommendations for today. All these reports are available at this website here, mref.org. Feel free to download these reports and go through the data and also the questions. We are very keen to hear the other report, the other groups like Jan and all the other groups and all the surveys that you have done, whether our results are similar or different. It will be interesting for us to do comparison and more detailed understanding of these survey studies. All right, so I'm going to quickly, given the small time left, to provide a summary of our key findings for this synthesis report. So essentially, we have figured out some of the key factors that shape women and men's political opportunities. For example, we realized that there's a key need for younger people to participate in politics because the young people tend to be shut out in decision-making processes at the local level. And we also realized that high education is very much privileged or seen as important as a selection criteria for many parties. We also found that the background of occupations of MPs are not very representative at the lower house. However, at the local or sub-regional level, the representatives are more represented or coming from more agricultural background. And we also found that political decisions are made more at the rural than in urban areas, where people come together more often at the rural areas, they contribute more, but we don't see that happening at the urban areas meetings. Another key finding is that we realized that a lot of candidates that we spoke to, family connection and involvement in politics matter a lot. So if you have a family member or father who has been involved in politics, there's a likelihood that his daughter will become involved in politics. Next, please. Political parties are also found to really favor candidates who have experience in politics and public life in the past. A lot of candidates that we have interviewed talked about their work in community or in politics or party politics before. So having some experience really helped in their probability of being nominated. Now, a lot of research has been done on gender and cultural norms in Myanmar. We wanted to find out how much these gender and cultural norms about political leadership matter. And we do find some gender differences. For example, women are seen less capable or able in security roles, and women are also more time constrained. Generally, attitudes towards leadership are mostly associated with maleness. So there's this patriarchal attitude towards political leadership still. And in our surveys, we are still analyzing at this moment, but preliminary results tell us that 40% of survey respondents think that men make better leaders than women. However, only 9% think that men make better, women think, only 9% think that women make better leaders than men. Also, a lot of academic literature has cited financial barriers or money as an important barrier for women candidates. For our research, we found that financial barriers is more significant at the national level competition rather than at a local. There's no gender difference at the local level. Now, probably for those institutionalists, you might be excited to know that we also found that institutions do disadvantage women more than men. For example, the 25% reserve seats for military, the first past the post system, and also the one vote system for household at wards and village level. And of course, the general militarization of public space is some kind of obstacle. But for more, please look at our working papers. Now, I have presented this in the previous presentation before, but I wanted to highlight some of these key findings because I think our research really have done a great job in terms of contributing in understanding more of intra-party politics and party organization, especially with regards to candidate selection. We found that parties really matter in terms of candidate selection of both women and men. But the fact that the Central Executive Committee in most parties are so heavily male-dominated, this has repercussions for the way they select their candidates. For example, you can see in the table here, most of the Central Executive Committee for the parties, the 9 parties we have conducted interviews with, have male-dominated CECs. Only KSDP and MNP have about 20 to 30% of female representation on CEC. So what that means is that the CEC, having such a strong role in selection, candidate selection, they are more likely to recruit other men from their networks and less likely to acknowledge the inequality problems. Our work, oh, sorry, I'm not done. Our work also found that parties differ a lot in candidate selection processes. There's no standardized process, but LNDP, NLD, and TNP has more a standard process that has been institutionalized. And MNP, PNO, and SNLD might appoint if there's fewer candidates. More importantly, we find that the bottom-up candidate selection process tend to have higher women candidates. So parties such as NLDP, NMP, NLD, and SNLD, who have some kind of bottom-up local processes in selecting and engaging with people from the villages, they tend to have more women candidates. However, the more military-aligned USDP or more patriarchal organized ANP and PNO, they tend to have less women candidates. Clearly, there are costs and benefits for pursuing political career in many parts of the world and likewise in Myanmar, but the political costs and personal costs are higher for women than for men, especially for the time loss and homeland difficulties and financial difficulties. We also try to understand a little bit more about the difficulties when both men and women go out to rally and campaign. And more than 50% of our respondents say that they experienced intimidation and harassment in the 2015 general election. However, there's no gender differences except for at the local level, and no physical violence has been reported from our survey and interviews. Now, finally, to our key recommendations, I'll just focus more on political parties and to NGOs and international donors. We think that based on the findings that we have thus far, it is very important for parties to establish clear rules for candidate selection and to publicize them. Hence, we rush to complete our working papers before the election. Hopefully, we can push these working papers and encourage to the political parties and encourage them to make clear their selection methods and their criteria. We also encourage parties to establish gender quotas at the party level in their selection. And Paul will probably speak a little bit more about this later on how that might impact candidate selection in this election. So for example, SNLD has imposed or established 30% gender quotas and very nearly met it. We also think it is important to provide some subsidies to women candidates, especially if they self-nominate, to encourage them to come forward. And we think it is important for parties to provide some form of security for female candidates who are campaigning in remote areas or during nighttime. What we think it is also important, given the use of social media in digital campaigning, especially right now, COVID-19, where parties are all campaigning online, it is important for parties to learn how to use social media effectively and equitably. Next, please. So for donors, international organizations, and NGOs, we recommend that attention to be made for smaller parties especially for smaller parties and underfunded parties, and to focus on funding and training women who self-nominate. We think that training classes for parties to use social media is so important. They have to learn how to use social media to expand their online presence in order to compete effectively. And training classes are also necessary for parties to respond to online hate, especially for ethnic minorities and for women or people from minority groups. The priority should be placed on small parties without large financial backing. So finances for NLD and for USDP are pretty established, and they have many funders. So for the next stage of research or investigation, priority should be placed on smaller parties. And based on our research, we think that attention should continue to be placed on the candidate selection processes to promote gender equality. Bottom up, for example, if we know that the parties have very strong personalities in the parties, then focus should be placed on talking to the party leaders to change their mindset about the importance of improving gender equality. However, if the parties have already established process of a bottom-up candidate selection method, then it is important to help spread that so that the different candidates know the criteria and can put themselves forward. Thank you very much, and I'll pass the presentation to Paul now.
Thank you. Paul?
Hi, thank you very much, Natina. So I haven't been able to spend lots of time working on what's happening for the 2020 election, but I thought it would be useful to share some thoughts with you about what we might see in the forthcoming election. So first of all, before we get on to some of the more specific gender issues, just to talk about some of the issues around enfranchisement and inclusion in the 2015 and this year's election. So in the 2015 elections, although these elections were more free and fair than a lot of observers were expecting, not everybody was able to vote. So there was about 500,000 Muslims, mostly Rohingya from Rakhine State, who lost their previous right to vote. And there were a number of ethnic Rohingya candidates who were also not allowed to run in the election. In addition to that, there was around 500,000 other voters, mostly from ethnic minority areas, that were not able to vote for security reasons because the the Union Election Commission deemed it unsafe to hold the vote in certain areas, or because electoral authorities were not allowed to come in and check voter lists because armed groups operating in those areas did not give them permission. And then finally, more than 100,000 refugees in Thailand, many of whom are Karen, but also from other ethnic groups, and most have been in the camps for quite a long time. They are all unable to vote as well. And when we look at enfranchisement for this year, the exclusions from the last election will largely be repeated. So the Rohingya that lost the right to vote in 2015 have not got it back, and many of them have now been forced out and are living in refugee camps in Bangladesh. Again, there's quite large numbers of voters that have been of areas that the Union Election Commission has decided not to run the vote in. And the Myanmar refugees in Thailand also are still not able to vote. And then I think there's probably been more controversy this time than last time in how the Union Election Commission has decided where to allow voting and where it has not. So a number of townships are not going to be able to vote at all, including 9 townships in northern Rakhine State that all voted for the ethnic Rakhine Party in the last election. At the same time, in neighbouring Paletwa Township in southern Chin State, which has experienced extremely intense conflict in the last year, as much as the other townships, like as much or more than any of the other townships in Rakhine State, but which voted for the NLD last time round, it's decided that voting will go ahead. And this has proved to be extremely controversial, and there are now several appeals around this issue, as well as some townships voting being cancelled completely. There's quite a few townships, mostly in ethnic minority areas, where voting has been partially cancelled and certain village tracts are not able to vote. And in a number of cases, there are valid security reasons for that. But the way it's being done is quite controversial, and there's a number of appeals currently taking place. The final issue around representation is kind of that Myanmar's current constitution and electoral system is not very good for representing ethnic minority interests, particularly is the first past the post system tends to result in one single party getting a disproportionate share of seats, which in the last election was the NLD, and we expect that to be the case again. And the other point is the reservation of seats. 25% of seats in parliament are reserved for the military, and this is a very ethnic Bamar-dominated institution, and the military also has an effective veto over any constitutional change. So now if we're looking at the gender equality of participation, in 2015, women were around 13% of all the parliamentary candidates, and ended up being elected as about 13% of the elected MPs. However, when we include the MPs that are appointed by the military, women are around 10% of all the MPs in Myanmar's parliaments. And for this year, the percentage of candidates that are women has increased slightly to 16%. And obviously it's difficult to say for sure, but based on the trend from last year, we would guess this will probably result in women being around 15 or 16% of elected MPs and around 13% of all the MPs. And as you can see from this table, there's a lot of variation between different parties this year in the percentage of their candidates that are women. So the Shan Nationalities League for Democracy, which introduced a quota for women's participation this year, has 29% women candidates, which is the highest percentage of any major party. The Mon Unity Party also scores very highly. NLD is above average. And then certain parties, I would say, draw your attention to the PAO National Organization, which is below average, and the USDP, which is also below average. And in 2015 as well, these parties also had low numbers of women candidates and even lower numbers of, even lower proportions of women MPs. And so, yeah, by SNLD introduced a target of having 30% women candidates. They didn't quite meet it, but they came extremely close in having 29%. And it represents quite a big increase from the last election. So although they were already better than average at the last election in terms of women's participation, they've increased it quite significantly from 17 to 29% this time round, by having a clear target to promote the number of women candidates and following it. And as I mentioned on the last slide, PNO and USDP have increased the proportion of their candidates that are female, but they are still below average. And when we look at differences between different areas, we can see that in Chin State and Rakhine State, if we take the average for all of the parties and across all of the parliaments that they are running for, these are the only two states or regions where women are less than 10% of all the candidates. And I mean, women's participation is generally quite low in parliamentary politics here. And for example, since the beginning of state and region parliaments in early 2011, there's never been any female MPs in either the Chin State or the Rakhine State Parliament. And there's been one or two women elected from those states to the national parliaments, but we fairly consistently see that women have quite low levels of engagement in or representation in party politics and parliament in these areas. Whereas Mon State and Yangon region fare much better, and these are the only states and regions in which women are more than 20% of all the candidates. And then finally, just to mention around violence and harassment. So although in our study of candidates in the last election, we didn't find any clear gender differences in the likelihoods of candidates to face harassment or violence. But I think this year's elections are already shaping up to be more violent than 2015. And I mean, there's already been one NLD supporter killed in a fight or an attack. It's not quite clear yet, the details, but basically some USDP supporters killed an NLD supporter. There've been 3 NLD candidates kidnapped by the Arakan army whilst they're campaigning in Rakhine State. And generally, there's been quite a lot of clashes between supporters of parties, particularly between NLD and USDP. So I think it's generally looking more fractious. And I think the other issue around violence and harassment is that more of it will be online than previously. So when we interviewed our candidates, we heard quite a lot of discussion previously about harassment online. But I think 2015, you wouldn't really characterize it as an online election, and there wasn't a lot of campaigning online. Whereas this year, even before COVID happened, it already looks like there was going to be a shift to more online campaigning than we'd seen before, as parties, particularly the wealthier and better resource parties, became more aware of how they could use online campaigning to help them. And with all the restrictions on movement that have come in under COVID, everything has moved online. So I don't have any data on this yet, but I'm expecting there to be a lot more online harassment of candidates this year as well. Oh, actually, sorry, there's one thing I forgot to mention. The data we presented in the table that shows the percentage of women candidates in each party is, this is preliminary data, and so it's best not to cite it because we haven't had time to double check everything yet. And so for all parties, this is preliminary data and subject to change before November 8th. And for the Kachin State People's Party, I only had that for 3 districts out of 4, so it's not entirely complete for that party. But anyway, I think those numbers give a rough indication.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Very good. We'll be cautious with the interpretations of the table. So thanks both of you